Hi there, welcome back to the Occultorium Historian. I'm your guide, Sapphire. And if this is your first video with us, welcome! Be sure to hit the like and subscribe button and stay tuned for more. We do a lot of history deep dives, I do a lot of educational history on this channel, plus we recently have a Patreon made. It is patreon.com/occultorium historian. So today we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive into the history of history, the evolution of historiography from basically the beginning of time. Since early humans began to function and look around themselves, they have been making history. We make history every day. But written history as we know it has only existed for roughly 5,000 years. Let's get into it. Written history is only roughly around 5,000 years old, beginning with the development of Sumerian cuneiform script around 3,200 BCE. The earliest forms of writing, or proto-writing, might even date back to 37,000 years ago. However, the term recorded history generally refers to the time when writing was widely used to document events and cultures. History education, or the way we teach and learn about the past, has undergone profound transformations over the centuries, from its beginnings in oral traditions to its current place in modern classrooms and digital platforms. The evolution of history education mirrors both cultural shifts and our changing understanding of the past. By tracing the history of how history is taught, we gain insight into how societies view their histories, pass them down to future generations, and ultimately shape our present. Now, on a side note, this channel as a whole is mostly focusing on Western history, or the history that is covered within Western civilizations. So, we will be covering the history of history according to Western traditions today. But if this video does well and gets enough interest, I will make a follow-up video on the understandings and history of history according to Eastern education as well in a future time.
You're on.
Good evening, ladies and emperors. I just got back from Venice, and boy, are my arms tired.
In the early stages of human civilization, history was not a structured discipline as we understand it today. Instead, it was conveyed through oral traditions, storytelling, and the work of scribes. Ancient cultures like the Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and Greeks pioneered the recording of their histories. Yet these early accounts often blended fact with myth. For example, Egyptian kings, known as pharaohs, were often deified in life and further immortalized in their deaths by being depicted as gods or demigods in inscriptions, tombs, and temples. This divine status was not only a political tool to legitimize their rule, but also a cultural norm, making it challenging for modern historians to distinguish factual events from religious or symbolic embellishments within ancient records. The blending of myth, ritual, and royal propaganda created a historical narrative where pharaohs like Ramses II or Akhenaten were remembered both as political figures and as divine beings at the same time, complicating efforts to extract purely historical truths from the surviving evidence. The Greek historians, particularly Herodotus and Thucydides, began to codify historical events, like the Greco-Persian Wars. Yet, Herodotus's work straddled the line between fact and fiction still. He reflected the ancient world's tendency to understand history not just as a record of events, but as a means of exploring human behavior and its lessons. In this way, early history wasn't about the precise documentation of facts, it was about understanding human nature through stories. As the Annales School reshaped the study of history in the 20th century, it also reignited an interest in ancient historiography, such as the works of Tacitus, which exemplify a blending of political, social, and psychological history. Tacitus, a Roman historian, is often studied as a figure who navigated the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. His work demonstrated how history, even in its earliest forms, often transcends the mere recounting of events to include an exploration of the human nature, ethics, and even power dynamics.
I smell something familiar! Yes! I got an idea! Pull over!
As civilizations advanced, religious institutions increasingly took the lead in shaping the way history was taught and recorded. In Europe, for example, particularly within Christian traditions, monasteries became vital centers of learning during the early medieval period. Monks and scribes were responsible for not only preserving ancient texts, many of which would have been lost without their efforts, but also for composing new historical works that reflected their religious worldviews. One key figure in this intellectual landscape was the Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731 CE. This is considered one of the most important sources for early English history. Bede's work was groundbreaking in that it combined theological interpretation with careful documentation, setting a precedent for future historical writing in the Christian world. Another monumental figure who advanced the study of history was Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century Arab historian and philosopher. Though operating within an Islamic context, his ideas profoundly influenced the philosophy of history itself. In his Muqaddimah in 1377, Ibn criticized blind acceptance of historical narratives and emphasized the importance of critical thinking, economic factors, and social dynamics in the study of history. His analytical approach challenged the purely religious interpretations dominated in both Islamic and Christian historiography at the time, and it did lay the groundwork for more secular sociological understandings of historical development.
Mill, that's all. I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
During the Middle Ages, history was not seen as an objective accounting of the past. Instead, it was deeply intertwined with religious teachings, and often written to glorify God, emphasize divine providence, and provide moral instructions. Historical narratives at the time served as a tool for reinforcing religious doctrine and encouraging virtuous behaviors. It really blurred the lines between fact, faith, and allegory at the time.
Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15... Wait. 10 commandments!
The Renaissance and the Enlightenment periods marked a profound transformation in the way history was understood and recorded. The Renaissance, literally called the Rebirth, sparked renewed interest in classical antiquity, leading scholars to recover and study the works of ancient historians. This revival of classical knowledge coincided with one of the most revolutionary technological advancements in history, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. This innovation democratized access to books and texts, allowing historical knowledge to spread far and beyond monasteries and royal courts. For the first time, history became the subject that could be studied and debated by a broader public. As this intellectual momentum carried into the Enlightenment, a new kind of historian emerged, one who questioned tradition, examined evidence critically, and sought to understand the underlying causes of historical events. Thinkers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu redefined the purpose of history. Voltaire, for instance, he moved away from chronicling kings and battles to writing the histories that explored culture, philosophy, and the evolution of ideas. His essay on the customs and the spirit of the nations, written in 1756, emphasized global and comparative perspectives, offering one of the first attempts at a truly world understanding of history. Another key figure who pushed forward the history of history during this period was Giambattista Vico, an Italian philosopher, often considered a forerunner of modern historiography. In his seminal work, The New Science, written in 1725, Vico argued the history followed discernible patterns and cycles driven by human development and cultural change, not merely divine will or isolated events. He emphasized the importance of myth, language, and collective memory in shaping historical consciousness. Vico's ideas challenged linear providential methods of history and laid really important groundwork for later historical methods that focused on society, culture, and ideology. Together, these thinkers helped move history away from being a religious or aristocratic narrative and towards an analytical, human-centered discipline. The Enlightenment reframed history as a tool not only for understanding the past, but also for shaping the future, an intellectual pursuit grounded in reason, skepticism, and a belief in progress.
How could you possibly know what the future holds?
Because I am from the future.
The 19th century marked a turning point for the formalization of history education, driven largely by the rise of public education systems across Europe and the United States. As industrialization and modernization spread, governments recognized the need for a unified national identity, and history became a very powerful tool for cultivating that identity. Nationalism surged, and with it, the design for school curricula began to focus on glorifying the nation's past. Students were taught stories of heroic leaders, pivotal wars, and revolutionary moments, less as objective records and more as morale and patriotic instruction. Within the United States, this meant celebrating the Founding Fathers, the Revolution, and the idea of manifest destiny in ways that often overlooked or minimalized the experience of indigenous people, enslaved Africans, or marginalized groups. Alongside this nationalistic turn in public education, the 19th century also witnessed the professionalization of history as a scholarly discipline. Universities began to establish dedicated history departments, and with them came the development of formal methodologies for studying the past. A pivotal figure in this transformation was Leopold von Ranke, a German historian who is often credited as the father of modern source-based history. Ranke emphasized the importance of primary sources, archival research, and objectivity, famously arguing that historians should aim to show the past as it actually happened. His approach shifted historical writing away from moralizing and mythologizing and toward a more evidence-driven analytical practice. Ranke's influence laid the groundwork for modern academic discipline of history, one built on rigorous documentation, peer review, and a commitment to critical inquiry. His legacy shaped how history was taught in universities around the world and set the standard for generations of historians to come. The 20th century ushered in seismic changes to history education, shaped by the political upheavals of social transformations of the era. The devastation of 2 world wars, the rise and fall of empires, and waves of decolonization and civil rights movements deeply challenged traditional Eurocentric narratives that had long dominated classrooms. In response, educators and historians began to recognize the urgent need to include diverse voices and experiences in the telling of history. Within the United States, for instance, history education slowly expanded beyond the familiar stories of the Founding Fathers and westward expansion. The narratives of enslaved peoples, indigenous nations, immigrants, women, and laborers increasingly found space in classrooms and textbooks. These additions aim to confront the nation's difficult past and provide a fuller, more honest account of American history. The Civil Rights Movement, Native American activism, second wave feminism, and the growing field of ethnic studies were all catalysts for this shift. This period also gave rise to critical history, a movement that questioned the assumption of objectivity and neutrality in historical writing. Scholars such as Hayden White argued that history is not a mere collection of facts, but also a narrative, a form of storytelling shaped by cultural, ideological, and rhetorical choices. His work, particularly Metahistory, written in 1973, challenged historians to examine their own assumptions, language, and structures influenced by histories they produced. Another significant contributor was Patrick Hutton, who emphasized the importance of memory and narrative in shaping historical understanding. He and others introduced the idea that history and collective memory are deeply intertwined, and that the past is often contested, fragmented, and filtered through present-day concerns. By the late 20th century, a new wave of global history emerged. Historians began to look beyond national borders to explore transnational issues like colonialism, environmental change, and global migration. The rise of global interconnectedness, particularly in the post-Cold War era, inspired history educators to shift their focus from national pride to global citizenship. In classrooms, this meant encouraging students to think critically about how different societies experienced and interpreted major historical events, fostering a more inclusive and empathetic understanding of the past. The result was a profound transformation in both the purpose and practice of history education. No longer simply a tool for national identity, history has now become a means of questioning power, uplifting silenced voices, and navigating a complex, interconnected world. The 20th century brought about a significant shift in historical methodology, with the emergence of the Annales School, a group of historians who radically redefined how history was studied and taught. Founded by French historians Marc Bloch and Lucien Favre, the Annales School emphasized an integration of multiple perspectives in understanding the past, moving away from traditional political narratives dominated by the actions of monarchs and military leaders. This approach advocated for a total history, or one that examines not only political events, but also the impacts within social, economic, and cultural factors that shaped through the course of history. In his seminal work, The Historian's Craft, Marc Bloch emphasized the need for historians to incorporate a broader range of sources and perspectives. The Annales School stressed the importance of understanding the totality of historical experience, offering a comprehensive view of the human past. This methodology also influenced the way history was taught, encouraging students to consider the complex interplay between different facets of society rather than focusing on isolated events or figures. This approach laid the groundwork for contemporary historical education, which seeks to balance both macro and micro historical analyses. The Annales set the stage for new ways of thinking about history that were inclusive to social structures, mentalities, and long-term historical development. This shift was revolutionary and reflected the increasing recognition that historical education needed to reflect the complexity of human experience and not just the events that made the headlines. Alan McGill, in his work, Coherence and Incoherence in Historical Studies, delves into how the Annales School's holistic vision of history paved the way for the development of new cultural history, which emerged in the later half of 20th century. McGill highlights how the Annales schools focus on social structures and collective mentalities directly influenced later scholars who sought to understand culture as a fundamental aspect of historical study. For example, rather than treating cultural phenomenon as a background, the new cultural history movement places them at the center of historical analysis, allowing history educators to incorporate ideas such as ideology, identity, and representation into the teachings.
The difference between the new cultural history and old cultural history, if you will, is that all cultural history in the past had been largely about high culture. So think, for example, of the fabulous book by Karl Schorsky on Vienna, talked about architecture, painting, music, but largely from a high culture point of view. New cultural history meant that you were talking about much more everyday forms of culture, not necessarily culture in the usual definition of the word, that is culture in terms of high culture, but culture more in the anthropological sense of the ways of life of people. So it was much more of an interest in how culture shapes social and political life, how language, rituals, symbols shape political life and even to a certain extent intellectual life, but certainly political life. But these were not high level theories, and they were not high art necessarily, but rather everyday forms of culture, like the clothing that people wore, how they talked about their neighbors, how they talked about other social classes. So it could be used in any place, any time in history.
Looking toward the future, the role of history education continues to evolve. Digital technology is reshaping how history is taught and experienced. Online resources, interactive tools, and virtual experiences are making history way more accessible and engaging for students around the world. Digital archives, virtual tours, and online discussions allow students to engage with historical materials in exciting new ways. Yet, despite the rise of digital tools, critical thinking still remains essential within history education. As students explore history through digital platforms, they must learn to question the narratives they encounter. Understanding the past is not just about memorizing facts. It's about interpreting historical events, recognizing biases, and understanding the context in which history is written. So, the history of history education reveals how societies have grappled with understanding and transmitting the past. From oral traditions to digital platforms, history education has continually adapted to reflect such changing values and needs. As we move forward, history education will remain critical, not only in understanding the past, but also in equipping the future generations to navigate and shape the world that they inherit. By focusing on critical thinking and fostering it, and a global perspective as well, history education will continue to serve as both a mirror to our past and a lens through which we can understand the present. So, I leave you with this one last question today. If history was once shaped to serve religion and power, how might our modern narratives still be influenced by unseen forces today? My name's Sapphire with the Occultorium Historian, and thank you so much for watching and listening to this video. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Your support goes a long way here, as it's just me in this little old archives. And be sure to stay tuned for next time. I have some pretty special projects coming up, and if you'd like to see some behind the scenes, please feel free to support us over on Patreon at patreon.com/occultoriumhistorian. There you'll be able to see a lot of behind the scenes, exclusive research, and maybe a few Q&As. Also, you might be privy to some of the future projects that are going on this summer. Until next time, stay curious.